So how do you deal with a group that is super risk averse? If they get a hint that there's a possibility of combat, they run away. First thought, right, is that there's probably a situation the party could be put in where they don't have much of a choice. And that doesn't mean that it's railroaded, like there's no other option for them, but like maybe the stakes aren't high enough for them to act. Maybe a location, their favorite tavern, maybe an NPC, maybe something has not been put at risk that if it were put at risk, they would jump into action on. That's one. And the second thought is if the threats that you're sort of spinning up for the party to engage with, just make sure that if the party runs, the party should always be able to run. But if they run, that means those bad guys are going to do something. They're going to grow stronger. They're going to escalate their threat. My party, one of my parties, ran once from a whole kind of region because they heard there were rumors of a dragon. They didn't want to face the dragon, so they turned around and fled. And then when they shenanigans happened later, about a year later in game time, the dragon had their influence over the region had grown, and they had basically were terrorizing an entire town at that point and was much larger than before. Like the threat got bigger. It can be frustrating sometimes when that happens, where you're like, oh, why would they not want to engage in this situation? But I would just sort of roll things on and say, okay, that means nobody's stopping this warlord, or nobody's putting down, these particular thieves, or nobody's stopping this hobgoblin from doing crazy stuff, or these kobolds are going to build some crazy contraption now. Like, just kind of think about, what would happen next? And make sure that there's a way for the party to hear about that. Another thing you could do, and this wouldn't be necessarily to twist the knife or whatever, or make them feel bad necessarily, but the world should react, right? Like if they're fleeing, if they come back to their sort of base of operations, there should be NPCs, there should be, the tavern keep, the innkeeper, the person who they got the horses from, or somebody that, sold them some gear before they left town. They should be like, hey, so how'd it go? Like, did you really, deal with that issue, in the next town over? And then have the party have to say, no, we didn't. And then you can, the world can react to what their decisions are, right? That can be really helpful either way, because then you can sort of put that mirror into the game world and kind of make them answer for it and see how they respond to that too. Those are just some thoughts, but Jesse forced them into risk. Sebastian, look up Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Narratively, characters tend to risk one of the higher level needs for the sake of securing a lower level need. That's a good point too. There was definitely a time in my first year of being a dungeon master, running a game just for my wife, just a solo game. There was specifically an encounter I can remember. I should look it up. But she ran, and it was like I didn't know how to handle it. It didn't make sense in the game. I was like frustrated. She was frustrated. It was a bad session. And then I read about it and learned how wrong I was and sort of corrected that. But now, rather than missing a combat opportunity, the players are giving you a gift. Really. Because it's so hard to keep bad guys alive past like a single encounter with a party, let alone multiple encounters. But if a party is willing to like somewhat engage or just kind of touch on an area and then like flee from combat, they're basically giving you a history with these characters. It's like it reminds me of the Game Maker's Toolkit video on the Legacy system in there's that Lord of the Rings game where like you'll fight an enemy and then they'll come back later remembering the fight. And that's really hard to do in D&D without some sort of, kind of jumping through hoops or being like, oh, I guess they can be resurrected, blah, blah, blah. But like if you could then take one of those enemies from an encounter where the party ran even if they never even engaged, but they just said, this is too dangerous, we're out of here. To be able to have somebody come in with people ready to attack the party saying, yeah, I was up in the tower. I saw you guys. I saw you see us and turn and flee. I know what you're made of. Like, talk about that kind of a badass villain speech going into a fight. Now the party has something to prove. Maybe they feel ashamed for that. Maybe as a result of them fleeing, the bad guys can be like, and also, once you left, we, stole what we wanted. We set this into motion. You guys don't even know that this other thing that you dealt with, we were responsible for that too. How does it feel knowing you could have stopped us if you'd been brave that day or whatever, right? Like, it just gives a whole bunch of context, right? So I would keep track of all of those moments and see what you can do creatively with them. Not with the goal being to turn the screws on the players necessarily, but to just make it sort of more narratively engaging, right? The story took a turn that you didn't expect, and as a result, like, what would be the most interesting thing to happen in the world as a result of that? What's going to happen when they come back to town and they're getting a drink and they're regrouping for the next adventure, and then slamming down and congratulating each other is an adventuring group that didn't run away and they are deemed heroes, and then they have to be in town when everybody's celebrating them because they saved, or they prevented, or they rescued, or they stole back some gold, and see how they feel about that. That would be interesting.